Welcome to the Section 1 review of Chapter 27. So this will be the first of 3 lectures for this chapter. So the way I want you to take notes for this chapter is going to be by creating a 2-column spice chart. And in the first column, you're going to take notes on China, on both the Qing and the Ming dynasties. And on the second column, you're going to take notes on Japan. So the second column, you will finish with the third lecture. The first 2 lectures will deal with China. And you want to be able to, in each box, write the most important developments, including the reasons for the developments as they come up. So you'll have to listen to the lectures, and add things that you don't already understand very well so that you have these notes. Also, if you hear me make comparisons to other topics that we've studied, right, you want to make those notes of similarities and differences as well. So the chapter goes over the quest for political stability, which is what this chapter is going to focus on, and then the second lecture is going to focus on economic, social, and cultural developments. And then in the third lecture, we will focus on section 4, which was Japan. So China is in a quest for stability following the rule of the Mongols. The Mongols unified in 1206, and they ruled over China after they conquered under the Yuan dynasty. And for over 100 years, China was ruled by a foreign power. And they had brought in advisors from also different parts of the Mongol realm to help them govern. So if you remember the last time when we studied the bubonic plague, it was chapter 22, I believe, you talked about the recovery in China and the foundation of the Ming. So that's where this chapter picks up. Okay. So the Ming dynasty starts in 1368, which was in the previous era, but it continues into this era, but it'll fall in this period, in the year 1644. So it kind of carries over between the 2 time periods that we studied. So if you recall, the last time we studied the Ming dynasty, I talked about, remembering the word bring, Ming bring, and the Ming bringing back native Chinese rule. So that's what they do under the Emperor Hongwu. They built a powerful imperial state. They revived the civil service exam that had been used by the Sui, the Tang, and the Song dynasties. They moved the capital from Nanjing, they moved it closer to the north to be closer to protect themselves from future Mongol incursions, to Beijing. Through the civil service exam, they're going to promote Confucian thought. They're going to engage in the building of fortified walls. They're going to abandon Mongol names and Mongol dress. Even the city of Beijing used to be Khanbalik, so they changed it back to Beijing. They gave it a Chinese name. And all of these are attempts to reinvigorate Chinese culture in China and erase the trace of Mongol rule. Under the Mongol rule, under the Yuan dynasty, that ruled from 1279 to 1378, during that period, or 1368, China was being influenced a lot by ideas that were not from China. And emperors like Yongle wanted to refocus on Chinese culture and Chinese ideas. So that was the element of the Ming that you should be familiar with. So fortifying the Great Wall. So the Great Wall that we see today is the Ming era wall. So there had been previous dynasties who had built walls, but the Ming reinforced it, expanded it, and the big, brick structures that we see today are the ones from the Ming era. They also begin to expand further south and spread their influence into Vietnam, into Cambodia, into the Philippines, Taiwan. Early on, they're trying to engage in Indian Ocean trade and bring a lot of trade into China. The Admiral Zheng He, we'd studied him before with his huge 7-mast ships, went into the Indian Ocean. All of these were attempts in the early Ming dynasty to revive China. But over time, the worry of economic stability made them more wary of outside ideas. It was also under the Ming Dynasty where they built the imperial palace known as the Forbidden City in Beijing. And in this palace, it was called the Forbidden City because the only people allowed inside this big palace complex were the emperor and his immediate family and his concubines and his eunuchs. So males who were castrated were allowed to go in, but no other males because there was a fear that someone would try to have children with one of the concubines, have that child claim to be the emperor's, and take the power through a different lineage. So eunuchs were used to help the Ming administer the realm. And so this is what's happening, during the 1400s, 1500s. A lot of wealth is flowing into China from trade, and they're building these magnificent palaces. There's also the Winter Palace. The Summer Palace. The Summer Palace that's also located near Beijing. And this is where the emperors started to spend a lot of time. And the Ming Dynasty begins to collapse partly because of the lifestyle that was lived in that Forbidden City. Around the 16th century, maritime pirates start to operate freely around the coast of China. Because there's so much trade coming in, pirates operate easily off the coast without a lot being done to them. The Navy is not able to respond to the threat. The government is not able to respond to the threat because the emperors are too busy living this hedonistic lifestyle inside of the Forbidden City. Emperor Wanli abandoned imperial activity completely to eunuchs. He didn't even meet with advisors. He left it up to the eunuchs to determine policy because he was too busy hanging out with his women, drinking, gambling, so engaged in just seeking pleasure. And that allowed people in China to really rely on eunuchs instead of an emperor. And that opened the doors to a lot of corruption. So by the time China started facing serious problems like famine, the government was unable to respond to the revolts. And so that's how the Ming Dynasty begins to decline and eventually collapses. In one of these peasant revolts that's overtaking China, the Ming emperors asked the Manchus, which were people that were from the they were north of China from the Manchu Qing Empire, who had been raiding parts of China. They invite them to help suppress Li Zicheng's rebellion. So Li Zicheng was the leader of the rebels because of famine, trying to overthrow the Ming. Well, the Qing are successful in stopping the rebellion, but then the Qing decide, well, we're the ones that did the work. We're going to be the ones that are going to stay in charge. And they found their own dynasty. So this leads to the end of Ming rule and the beginning of a new dynasty by the Qing, the people that came from Manchuria. So the Qing dynasty is another dynasty that governs, that is non-Chinese. The Manchu are from Manchuria, which is north of China. But they're not going to rule the same way that the Mongols are going to rule. They're going to assimilate a lot more into the Chinese style of government. And it's under the Qing dynasty that China reaches the size and what we know today. So you can see from this map the different expansions, and then the states in orange are tributary states, states that paid tribute to China but were not conquered. You can see in the middle, where you see the Great Wall, that used to be the limits of the Ming Dynasty. So the Qing expands a lot more, and again, you look at the borders of modern-day China, and it's pretty much very similar to what the borders of the Qing Dynasty were at its extent, which now include Manchuria. So in order to legitimize power, emperors continued to use the Ming Dynasty ideas, and these are ideas that had been part of China dating back to the ancient dynasties, the Zhou, the Shang, the Qin, the Han. And that was by calling the emperor the son of heaven and using a concept called the mandate of heaven, that as the son of heaven, you are given the ability to govern China so long as you do so effectively. The Manchus continued the policies of the Ming Dynasty because they didn't want to make it look like a disruption. They didn't want to create instability in China, and they found it easier to rule if the Chinese accepted them as rulers because there was continuity as opposed to trying to implement new policies where they might face more resistance. So the emperors continued to go to the Temple of Heaven for annual ceremonies to pray for good harvest. And I want you to be able to compare these ideas of legitimizing power to what we've studied in other empires, what we studied in Western Europe, and either legitimizing their power through constitutional monarchies or through the absolute divine right of kings, right? Be able to compare how rulers consolidate and legitimize power, right? So we saw this when we studied Europe and consolidating the power by controlling the nobles, by raising standing armies. Remember what we studied that in Europe. So in China, monumental architecture is used as a display of power. And the Forbidden City is one of the examples where you could see this. This was the palace that was built by the Ming Dynasty, and no one could leave or enter without the emperor's permission. Having this as your home, right, is a way of displaying that you are bigger than everybody else. And heaven looks positively on your reign by allowing you to maintain control of this realm. So having these big palaces as the homes of the rulers was one way of displaying your power above any other noble, above any other wealthy family. But there were other ways that they administered their empire that were also unique and influential to other regions in China. And that was like the civil service examinations. So every year, people took an exam to try to become a government servant. If you could become a government civil servant, that means you work for the government helping administer one of the many different departments. It brought prestige to you and your family. It opened the door to upward mobility, to power. And these were exams where the government only allowed, in the municipal exams, the big ones, they only allowed 300 people to pass per year. So they had a quota that no more than 300 people could pass because there's not enough jobs for everybody in government. So the exams took 3 days and 2 nights. People were only allowed to bring with them a water pitcher, a chamber pot to use the bathroom, their bedding, food, an inkstone, ink, and brushes. And they were inspected. They had to have ID. And then they were pretty much locked away for 3 days and 2 nights working on essays. So sounds kind of like you guys, right? Before finals week, right? Where you're going to be locked up for 3 or 2 days working on essays. But this examination system was a way of staffing the elaborate bureaucracy while also promoting the Confucian values. Since the focus was on Confucian texts and Neo-Confucianism, people had to learn the characters of the Chinese alphabet to read these texts. They also were learning the values of Confucianism, and we're going to talk about those in one of the other lectures. Now, as the Qing dynasty began to prosper and grow, it also became wary of foreigners. And so with economic growth comes tight regulation. And the Qing dynasty started a policy of beginning to close China off. They tried to end maritime activity. In 1661, they tried to evacuate the whole southern coastal regions because they didn't want people engaging with merchants and bringing in foreign ideas that could destabilize China. Although they did continue to trade actively with Japan, and they had one port reserved for the Portuguese and one for the British, they began to lose technological grounds to the Europeans. And so we get some history lessons from the Qing dynasty. China, for the longest time, since at least 2000 BCE, had been one of the leading civilizations in the world. And at the height of the Roman Empire and the Roman power in the Mediterranean, the Han Dynasty were exerting just as much power and influence in East Asia. And at the time, the Abbasids were experiencing their golden age. The Song and the Tang dynasties were governing over a very vibrant Chinese society. Lots of inventions. Think of gunpowder, paper money, movable type, the compass. All of these were coming out of China. And China was a cultural innovator, leading nation, leading economic powerhouse. When the times begin to change, and the emperors want to maintain their old traditions and they want to not let foreign ideas or new systems influence China, they don't adapt and they begin to lose technological grounds. So this is the beginning of the decline of China. And so China will go into a period of decline for about maybe 200, 300-year period of decline. By the 1800s, they are very weak and at the mercy of Europeans. And by the early 1900s, the Qing dynasty will eventually collapse. China will fall into a period of anarchy with no government and competing factions and warlords. And it will face a civil war. These factions will put their differences aside during World War II to fight the Japanese who invade. And it isn't until 1949, when Mao Zedong establishes the communist state of China, that China begins to once again start to seek stability. And it isn't until maybe the last couple of decades where China is once again a powerful global economic power, has a lot of economic weight. It is now the second largest economy in the world. But to people who study history, that's not a surprise. It isn't like they came out of nowhere. China has always been an economic powerhouse. It was just the last few hundred years that it was in a decline because of policies started by the Qing dynasty. And so the lesson here is, when the world around you is changing, you could shut yourself off to those changes as much as you want. The world will keep moving, and if you don't adapt to it, you end up being left behind by it. And that's going to create the problems that will eventually lead to the collapse of the Qing dynasty. Okay? So in the next lecture, we're going to focus on the economic, the cultural, and the social. So I will see you then.